All right, great. Happy to be here. So yeah, my name is Ben Knapp at University of Missouri. I'm a silviculture professor. I've been teaching about 2 to 3 silviculture classes a year for the last decade or so. And these two papers came out about 5 years ago. First time I've heard the term pyrosilviculture. So kind of scratched my head a little bit. If you think about silviculture, and there's various definitions you see, but definition of silviculture is going to be theory and practice of controlling the establishment, composition, structure, growth. You could add other things in, health, biodiversity, forests and woodlands to meet the needs, diverse needs and values of society and landowners on a sustainable basis. Kind of a mouthful. It's a long definition. It encompasses a lot of things and it's quite broad. And so when I saw pyrosilviculture, I said, well, I see fire as a tool in the toolbox of silviculture. And so it's kind of already embedded in there. So I scratched my head a little bit and was very interested in these papers. So this is a definition of pyrosilviculture that comes from the paper on the left, the first of the two that came out. And it brings two things up. And one is treatment specifically to use fire directly to meet management objectives. And two, alter non-fire silvicultural treatments so that they optimize the incorporation of fire in the future. And so there's a little bit of additional context that comes in with this term. This talk is not really a commentary on pyrosilviculture and what it is. It's more going to be about oaks and looking at oak silviculture. But I wanted to use this framing and framework to kind of talk about a few things. This is a table that comes from the more recent North paper on pyrosilviculture. And it includes this table that shows these two different scales at which pyrosilviculture is discussed. And one is the stand level scale, which thinking about sort of traditional silviculture, we're applying prescriptions at the stand level. We're making decisions at the stand level. But then also they bring up the importance of the landscape scale and thinking about various kind of the arrangement of treatments across the landscape and how we're bringing fire into sort of landscape scale processes. So I think that's also important. So kind of thinking about 3 interpretations I have from the pyrosilviculture papers that are going to relate to what I talk about. The first, these papers have come from Western forests, and I think there's a bit more of a separation of fire from silviculture. And silviculture has been defined and thought about more as thinning trees, a little bit more restrictive than kind of what we'll get into with some of the oak silviculture. And there's reasons for that, the context of the systems, the barriers to burning in the West from a prescribed fire standpoint, the prevalence of wildfire. So one is thinking about this kind of context of prescribed burning and silviculture have been, in a lot of cases, categorized separately. 2, the idea that fire is fundamental. And I think in this meeting, that's been a big theme when we're thinking about fire and oak systems. A lot of what we're talking about with ecological processes are fire driven. And so one of the pyrosilviculture papers uses the term process driven ecosystems, and they really link that process and those processes to fire and what fire is doing in those ecosystems. So we'll think about that. And then third, the consideration of the spatial, different spatial scales at which we look at things. And I added temporal scales in too, because I'm going to bring that up in a couple of cases. So first, thinking about prescribed burning in oak silviculture. In my mind, there's been quite a long history and a number of decades where we have thought about the use of fire, again, kind of as a tool in the toolbox in terms of oak ecosystems. And there's 2 things I'm going to highlight. I think we could come up with others, but one is using fire for oak regeneration. And we've talked through the messification problems and issues with oak regeneration. And there's been quite a bit of work done on specifically how can fire be used to favor oaks. Some of that work has been successful, find yes, it can. Some has not been, and finds that red maple resprouts, and there's other kinds of issues. A lot of work that Pat Brose did was addressed towards this topic. This is one example, a meta-analysis he produced to kind of get at that question. I think from a silvicultural standpoint, the use of fire for regeneration can be a separate use and a use that's prescribed in very specific ways that may be different than the use of fire for woodland restoration. And I think we can see silvicultural systems where fire is used at a certain point in that system to favor oak regeneration, when the intention may not be to produce a woodland, an open system with the other characteristics, herbaceous ground flora, fuel-fired feedbacks. So I consider on the right here woodland restoration to be potentially a separate objective. And from that context, I think about in a lot of oak ecosystems, fire is a tool in the toolbox for specific objectives. I think there's been a history of that here. It's a little bit different, perhaps, in the context of the pyrosilviculture papers. This was a paper that came from Brose that outlined the integration of fire into a shelterwood system, kind of a classic silvicultural system. And this is kind of for quite a while one of the big oak regeneration methods, the Brose shelterwood method, where you have a hardwood forest. Typically, you have oak in the overstory and more shade-tolerant species beneath. Apply a shelterwood cut to open things up, and then use a specific application of fire to try to affect composition. Knock back some of the tulip poplar and some of the competitors, create a competitive layer of oak, and then you can withhold fire and regenerate your oak system. An example of a specific use of fire for a regeneration approach. What I find interesting in this paper from '99 is that Pat Brose laid out these different kind of choose your own adventures for fire use. So at the end of the sequence, once oak's in place, you can remove the overwood like you do in a shelterwood and grow an oak stand. And so once you get oak competitive, you could take fire out, and then you could, in theory, leave fire out, which a lot of people do on the landscape, and grow a new oak forest. A second option is you could keep that overwood on there and have a 2-age stand, and so have a little more structure. But the third option was you can just keep burning, and you can stockpile resprouting oak and push things towards what he calls a savanna. And so in this case, he's actually outlining different objectives for the use of fire, which I think is interesting to see in this relatively early paper on fire in oak systems. Second kind of idea here is fire fundamental in oak ecosystems. I think people in this room would say yes. And I think we have sort of an audience of that shared kind of mind that fire is fundamental in oak ecosystems. I think working with practitioners, I was teaching a field studies course for silviculture last week, and we were out with a number of practitioners in the state of Missouri, and there were several who made comments about how, oh, this oak forest is very good for timber. I would never use fire in this forest. In reality, I think there's a mindset among managers across the eastern U.S. where fire may not be fundamental to oak ecosystems. It may be, again, a tool we use at certain times, important for regeneration, important things, or for certain things, but we could remove it, and then we could still have oak forests. I'm not saying that's the correct viewpoint, but I think that viewpoint is prevalent and something to think about. So not universal agreement to that idea. However, I think there is pretty universal agreement that fire is fundamental to oak woodlands and savannas, given a lot of the structural things we've talked about today, given a lot of the other characteristics of those, ground flora, function, and process. And then this idea of process-driven sort of ecosystems with fire. I'm going to talk about the recruitment that we see of oak within oak woodlands, and how this kind of process, I feel like, is not as well understood, perhaps, as we would like it to be able to develop better silvicultural prescriptions. So I'll call this the woodland paradox. And thinking through this, we've heard a lot today about how very frequent fire is really important to get our woodland structure, to get our herbaceous ground flora in place, and in a lot of cases, to reduce the encroachment of woody plants. And that's absolutely true. A lot of times we're burning on 3 to 5 year return intervals, sometimes more frequently. so we can maintain open structure. On more productive sites, especially if we take fire out even 5 years or longer, we get this ingrowth, this encroachment, and we lose that characteristic woodland structure. So we have on one hand the need to burn to keep things open. We also, from thinking about how oaks regenerate, there's a lot of literature that looks at and talks about a 10 to 30 year fire-free period needed to recruit new oaks to the canopy. A extended, at least to some degree, and I think we could talk about how variable that could be, but a period where fire is removed, where we see recruitment happen for replacement of the overstory. So on one hand, very frequent fire is necessary for structure, and on the other, if we want to have recruitment occur, we've got to think about what that process is going to be. Okay, so thinking process driven here. I think the previous presentation, thinking through longleaf pine and some work with shortleaf pine, we have, I feel like, more empirical evidence and description of that recruitment process with frequent fire in pine systems. I don't think we quite have that empirical characteristic in oak systems. So bringing this back to silviculture, here's our classic silvicultural system with different components of tending, regeneration, and harvest, what we think about in this kind of cycle. In the silvicultural system, the tending phase is where we essentially have our trees in place for that particular stand, and we're adjusting structure, composition, growth rate, things like that. So in a lot of cases, when I think about this framework, I think that the frequent burning that we do is a tending kind of approach. We're trying to use frequent burning in a woodland to maintain a structure of trees already there, and as well as ground floor composition and other habitat features. We're doing that with frequent fire, and fire is needed. We've heard the term maintenance phase. We're in the maintenance phase of burning. It's kind of like this tending phase where we're kind of keeping things with those trees that we currently have. And I think fire is very good for doing that in a woodland. I'm going to touch on 2 studies we have in Missouri to give some examples of fire's effect on certain things. This is a study that's a long-term prescribed burn study in oak systems. It's called the University Forest Study. And it was set up in 1950. It's got 3 different treatments: an annual burn, a 4-year burn, and a control. And our records indicate it's been going on continuously. So we now have 75 years plus of information. We've got great data that go back to when they started and then about 15 years or so intervals. And I've put on this stocking chart here. The blue line shows the structure, the stocking change, and the unburned control. And then the red represents the annual burn, and the orange, the 4-year burn. Fire with nothing else has opened these from a forest structure to a closed canopy woodland structure and has maintained that through time. So structurally, fire has kind of reached some marks, if you will, in the system. This is another look at structure at this site, and we have the top representing the control. So you have a picture here and then a diameter distribution. Basically, this is a reverse J. The scale here is much higher so that we could actually see the small trees, but it approximates the reverse J, very filled in structure that you could see with the forest. What's interesting in the annual treatment here, there's a complete elimination of woody plants in the understory, and that's up to about a 10 centimeter, 12 centimeter diameter, so about 4 to 5 inch tree. We have no woody plants. Beautiful herbaceous understory, but we do not have that woody component present on that site. In the 4-year burn, it looks like this. If you could see this picture, it's a little small. It's a sea of resprouting hardwoods. And so we also have this gap from anything about 1 inch in diameter up to that kind of 4 or 5 inch diameter size. There's nothing there, but there are resprouting hardwoods for sure. This data indicates there's been no recruitment to the overstory since 1964. And so those 4-year burns have interrupted that process completely. And what's really driving the openness that we see is a lack of recruitment into that overstory. So thinking about tending, these frequent burns are certainly efficient at keeping things, getting things open and keeping things open. In the silviculture system, we also have the harvest stage. This is where we're sort of transitioning from one rotation or age of the forest to the next. And so I think this is an area that gets a little less defined in woodlands, where we're thinking about regenerating through harvest. And one thing I'll point out is in most of our silvicultural systems, they're going to put our stand structure in this sort of part of the stocking chart. It's a more open system. By design, the purpose of that is to create space for new trees. The purpose is to regenerate. So really, in an open canopy woodland setting, the tree structure is such that those sites have space for new trees. So in a different context, the context of a regeneration harvest, we're creating this structure to allow woody trees to regenerate and grow. In a woodland, we're creating it for open structure, but then we're using fire to beat back the regeneration that is occupying that growing space. So again, a bit of a contradiction or a bit of a challenge there. So the harvest stage, in some cases, maybe we don't really need to apply. The system's already open in woodlands. In closed canopy woodlands, we are a little bit denser and things slow down in terms of regeneration. The second study I'll mention is called the Chilton Creek Fire Study. Also in Missouri, this is a landscape scale burning study that uses about 400, 500 acre units. It's been going on since the 90s, and it has an annual unit and then burning about every 2 to 4 years and sampling throughout. In this, I've looked at the data from this study to kind of look at changes in regeneration and recruitment dynamics through time. There will be a flash talk coming up with a master student presenting on seedlings. This is looking at the ingrowth, trees entering the overstory size class through time. And so that's a 5-inch diameter for that size class. And basically the red is showing our fire treatment. And we see that that ingrowth is decreasing consistently through time. We're seeing a reduction in the number of trees we have coming into the overstory, whereas the unburned control has some fluctuation, but was statistically not different through time. Fire through time is doing what we expect to small trees. So this is a distribution of size in the mid-story, so from 5 centimeter to 10 centimeter. And basically we're seeing this kind of reduction in tree number across all size classes. Okay. A few things I'll point out here though. One, we have not eliminated trees that are in sort of smaller size classes. There are still some on the landscape that could serve as a population source for recruitment in the future, as well as we have not yet eliminated that from the ingrowth into the overstory. But this raises a question, and sometimes we call this the fire trap, how we look at recruiting or getting seedlings and saplings from that resprout layer into the overstory. So I think a couple questions come up to me. With the fire trap limiting recruitment, and we certainly have seen it for decades at this long-term burn site, how do we regenerate woodlands? How do we go about doing that? Part of that question is how much recruitment is enough? These are open systems, so we don't need to have maybe the classic reverse J we see in uneven age silviculture. We don't need to have a ton of small trees, but how many do we need? And that becomes a population dynamics question. Because we need to think about how many new trees are coming from the understory to the midstory, and then how many are moving up to larger diameter classes through time in the overstory. Fire at the same time is going to potentially top kill and move things back into the understory, or outright kill and take things out of the system. So some of the overstory trees through time may disappear, becomes more open. Other things get put down in that lower resprout layer. And so how do we move things up? I'm going to be real quick with this, but we did an exercise with a transition matrix, a life table, where we used data from this Chilton Creek study. And we had individual trees tagged in 1998, and we tracked their fate in 2017. And this shows the proportion of trees in those size classes that in 20 years later occurred in the next size class. So this gives us data on population change through time. If we, for example, look in 12-inch or 12-centimeter trees, this column shows what proportion died. About half of those trees died 20 years later, and about 20% were now 14-centimeter trees. We did this with the whole population, so we could look at how that population shifts in a 20-year period. What we did next was took that and projected that forward. And so used that population matrix with the number of trees that we saw recruiting, the number that had entered the overstory class. And we see over a series of multiple projections, we see that population end up going down to a very open condition, essentially a savanna, where recruitment was not supporting the structure. There's some simplified assumptions here, like the rates of growth and mortality are constant, but this demonstrates this kind of shift that we see. From this, we could also estimate that it would take about 8 trees recruiting per hectare per year, which is like 7 or 8 times what we saw, to stabilize that population, given those rates of survival and growth. And so that well exceeded what we were seeing on the site. Took another approach and said, well, what if we had periods of extensive tree recruitment where that whole stand essentially recruited, and then that fire was brought back in, sort of like a longer fire-free period where we had a pulse of recruitment. And so we looked at stabilizing that structure with 400 trees recruiting every 60 years, sort of a pulse that came in. So I'm going to wrap up with some kind of takeaways, thinking about how regeneration and fire, this frequent fire, can mix. We need this fire-free period. How can we potentially maintain woodland structure? What are our expectations for regeneration? I think there's the idea of an uneven aged approach, where we're going to see tree recruitment happen in either canopy gaps, like local areas throughout a stand, because conditions are different. And those different conditions can affect fire behavior, can affect resources for those seedlings. I actually do not have good pictures of this in oak. I was putting this talk together and I was trying to find pictures of canopy gaps in oak with oak regenerating, and I don't have good pictures of that. Maybe some of you do. But I took this picture from a shortleaf pine stand, where we can see here under the intact canopy, the oak has been top killed in a recent fire. But in this gap, we have quite a bit of recruitment happening. This had been burned a few months prior, and before that, the last burn was 4 years. So it was about a 4-year period for those trees to become that size. So I think this shows evidence of this happening, but I haven't seen a lot of it for oak woodlands. The second approach would be an even-aged approach. And in this approach, there's more of a deliberate decision made on providing a fire-free period to woodland stands. And so this could follow what we think about as a area regulation in silviculture, where you have a larger compartment, and in that compartment you've separated different woodland units, and you basically schedule into those a fire-free period so that recruitment can happen. So in this case, you've got a couple areas that in this depiction we say there's a harvest, maybe it's opened more, but then a fire-free period is provided so that we can get recruitment and we can get new trees coming into that zone. Through time, that just shifts across that unit. And so now you have fire moved back into those stands, say after 20 years, and you open things back up and you maintain more of an even-aged woodland that shifts across the landscape. This introduces a temporal complexity where there's some kind of recruitment period in a woodland which in my mind aligns fairly well with periods of variability in historic fire return intervals. We're not looking at a 3-year consistent return interval, but periods where there may be a 15-year interval where something like this could happen. All right, so I know I'm probably out of time. Fire silviculture and oak ecosystems. I think fire has been integrated into prescriptions in a lot of cases, and we can think about specific uses of fire in oak ecosystems for regeneration or different purposes. I think fire is fundamental, but there's a lot we're still learning about that. And I think there's a lot we're learning about, especially these recruitment dynamics and what to expect in terms of oak woodlands so that we can maintain structure through time. And finally, that scale idea, both spatial and temporal, I think applies. We're thinking about an area regulation approach. We're thinking about spatial patterning, but also temporal variation, where perhaps this recruitment period in an oak woodland is something that should be considered. So I'll end there. And I don't know if there's time for questions, but